as symbols of identity and like the post-Soviet perspective, because this is what I do in the Slavic department here at Brown. So basically, I justify my funding, my time spent in the summers in Russia, just forcing people to museums and taking pictures and just trying to interpret them. So the first sort of question that comes, if I can just get to the next slide, is why Russia? So obviously, as the accent shows, it's really subtle. I am English. So the question I always have, especially when coming into America at the border, is why is an English person studying Russian or Russia, Russian culture in America, or even why at all? And it's sort of something that's been plaguing me my entire life. And obviously, when we think of Russia, we have like these fantastic stereotypes, which are not true as much as they are true, of bears walking on the streets, like copious amounts of vodkas, the Russian grandmothers known as babushki being able to push themselves around in the Kremlin and everything going around. And those first instances when you go to Russia, like it's difficult to work out if this is a stereotype or not, especially if you go to Moscow and you see sort of this conglomerations of sort of colliding worlds coming in together. But my sort of own journey with Russia was that I effectively bullied my parents into getting me a Russian tutor when I was about 13. Very graciously they accepted, and I did my Russian GCSE, which is a standard level examination in England, and then my A level. And then when it came to university, I was told to do what I enjoyed the most. So that was Russian and history. And through there, working in Russia and in Kyrgyzstan, it sort of just continuously developed. And what I've always been really interested in is how does Russia see itself? How does it relate to itself? So that is, what does Russia see itself being? What defines it as Russia? And what it comes down to is this idea that a lot of the interpretations in disciplines like political science or even literary study or cultural study don't pay, in my opinion, sufficient attention to the continuing movements in Russian memory, and in particular Russian cultural memory, and what's happening there. And I think a very good way, a good conduit into this is, of course, monuments. So the importance of monuments is relatively clear, is because they are sort of a totemic representation of characteristics and figures or narratives that define a society. So for example, if you go to Washington, DC, you have a huge pantheon to Abraham Lincoln, the George Washington Monument. In London, you've got Trafalgar Square, you've got the Buckingham Palace, you've got the Houses of Parliament, which acts as symbols and sort of static symbols of what are the core defining features of that society, whether it's democracy, whether it's a certain battle, whether it's a certain cultural uniqueness. And in having these as parts of the cityscape, or even just the general scape of a country, they send us sort of continuous reminders of how the population should engage with its past and how it should see itself, how it should identify itself. Interestingly, of course, you have monuments that are often erected by political elites. So whether that's a government or a certain organization in the NGO sector that has links to pressure groups, which shows that there is an idea that these monuments are not always directly representative, but rather they are like a symbolic capital. They're a symbolic representation of what should be achieved or what should be ascribed to. And there are obviously examples of people creating their own monuments that are hyper-specific to regions or to a certain set of groups as well. But importantly, in creating like a physical manifestation of this, it sends out a clear signal that this is part of the wider national imaginary and the pantheon of heroes that we should be looking at as a nation. So when we look at them in Russia, and also we'll be talking about Ukraine a little bit today, it's important to see what is being presented, what is not being presented, because it shows wider trends in terms of the quest for national identity and also the cultural memory of the country itself. So anybody who has been to any of the post-Soviet states, pretty much in every city up to this point, you have a statue of Vladimir Lenin. Now this comes because the Soviet Union knew the importance of symbolic capital. It knew that importance of showing and demonstrating who is the new new figures who should be commemorated, venerated within a society. This comes down to the fact that obviously the Soviet Union emerged out of the ashes of the Russian Empire. So the two revolutions in 1917 and the Russian Civil War that protracted until 1923 meant that even though there was a new Soviet Union, there was still a population who had been born in the Russian Empire. Moreover, in the fact that the Soviet Union was built in diametric opposition to the empire, it needed to foster a new sense of identity. And obviously the most easiest, the most brilliant, the most conceptual way of doing this was to venerate the legacy of Vladimir Lenin as the leader of the Bolshevik movement and the lead revolutionary. So this Lenin actually is my Lenin, I like to call him, in St. Petersburg at Moskovskaya Ploshchad by the Moskovskaya Metro. This is the old government building for St. Petersburg, so it's in the south of the city, and I lived around the back of it. So each day for 6 months when I was living in St. Petersburg, I'd walk past Lenin, down into the metro, go to university, come back, walk back, and there he was again. And if you go to any other city, even places like Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, Almaty in Kazakhstan, or even further flung cities in the Russian Federation, you have the same representation of Lenin. And this is a particularly important one because this is effectively evoking the idea of Lenin getting off his train at Finlandsky Vokzal, sort of crying out forward, saying "Davai Period," which means like towards, let's go forward, so evoking the revolution. Having him in the central square is important because what it does is it shows that he is central to the city, is central to the conception. And this was part of a wider process that happened in the 1920s up until really the 1980s of claiming the city for the Soviet identity. So streets were renamed after important holidays, important people, important organizations. Cities were even renamed. So for example, St. Petersburg went from St. Petersburg to Petrograd during the First World War to Leningrad up until the fall of the Soviet Union. So it was basically using public space to show who these new Soviets were, how they should remember themselves, and what aspects of this memory is important to their culture and into their culture. However, as we know, the Soviet Union is no longer around. And in 1991, it collapsed through a very multifaceted process. And here on the right, we have a map of the USSR, what it was before, and the countries that came after it. So you have Ukraine here, Kazakhstan, and Russia is the big red one. And the same thing that we can see, or we can argue for, that happened in the 1920s and 1930s, that of two generations of new Soviet versus old imperial, happens again and has occurred in the post-Soviet space. So post-Soviet just means anywhere that's really in that map there. So all the way down to Azerbaijan and Georgia, to the Baltic states, and then Central Asia as well, including Russia. The question comes down to that the populations and the nations that emerged had entire cities, monuments, narratives, cultures that were built around an ideological structure that was no longer in place. So we have to question what happens in the city afterwards, what happens with monuments afterwards. Do the countries see themselves as post-Soviet, meaning that they accept their Soviet past, but now they're sort of moving forward a bit with it? Or do they see themselves as something else, like post-colonial, meaning that they see the period of being part of the Soviet Union as an occupation or as a colonization effort? And the examples we're going to look here at is particularly in Ukraine, because there is a divergence of views here. So from 1991 onwards, the statues in the entire of Ukraine that are commemorating Lenin have been removed. And this has been called a process of Leninopad. And that's a portmanteau of Lenin and then pad from padats, which means to fall in Russian. So just the falling of Lenin. And this picture taken from a local news website in 2014 shows it really well. Now, the question of whether it's post-colonial or post-Soviet comes down to how does Ukraine conceptualize itself? And a brief appraisal of Ukrainian identity politics, as well as its general political stance, has shown that from the 1990s onwards, well, until the Maidan Revolution of 2014, there's been quite a vast oscillation between being very pro-Russian to pro-European to pro-Russian to pro-European. And the question comes down to then is, what legacy do these Lenin statues have? Do they show that they are pro-Russian? Do they show that because they are pro-Soviet, and with Russia being the inheritor of the Soviet Union, thus there is a linkage of a common heritage? Or are they standing as physical representations of a time that Ukraine and its nationality was repressed and not seen as an actual implementation of what it was doing? So looking at processes like this are important because it shows wider trends within memory study and also national identity in of itself. So here you can see, this is a map taken from the Ukrainian Center up at Harvard, who I was able to talk to a year or two ago. And this map here shows the incidences of Lenin statues in Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union. So the big square shows 5 Lenin statues in one place, with the smallest being 1. And as you can see, it's pretty ubiquitous. It's in all of the huge population centers across the country. However, there are very few, if any, left in the country now. The only places that are left are in here in Crimea, which has been annexed by Russia, and in the east, in the Donbass region, which is currently in a transitional period as it's trying to claim independence with Russian backing. A second analysis from the Ukrainian Center created this map here, which shows the time frame in which monuments to Lenin were taken down. So the gray shows that they were taken down before December 2013, so over here in the left. Yellow that was taken down at the end of between 2013 and 2016. And red red is where they have remained. So here again, so those 2 areas, the Donetsk and Lugansk region and the Crimean region of Ukraine. Importantly, what this shows is that there's sort of a west to east trajectory. This in itself is an interesting one, because if you find linguistic maps of Ukraine, you can find that there are higher incidences of Ukrainian being the national language in this region compared to Russian being the first language here in this region. So it shows how in a country like Ukraine, where there is a mixture of languages and ethnic identities and national identities in there because of the post-Soviet heritage, they're trying to reconcile, well, what does it mean to be part of Ukraine in of itself? In 2015, the president at the time, Poroshenko, enacted a law that outlawed any communist symbols, and they had to be removed from within the country. So we can sit there and say that there is an interpretation that these, particularly these monuments to Lenin, are representative of a past that is no longer wanted. Interestingly, as well, in this region here, in lots of the places that were taken, that Lenin monuments were taken down, what was put up were monuments to local heroes or perceived Ukrainian heroes, in particular Stepan Bandera. Stepan Bandera as a figure is very controversial. He was seen as a freedom fighter in Ukraine while seen as a fascist sympathizer in Russia. This is due to his work, his actions during the Second World War, in which he collaborated with the Nazis in occupying Ukraine in order to try and get some sort of leverage to create an independent Ukraine of the Soviet Union. So the question that then presents itself is, well, what's the legacy? So in putting up Stepan Bandera, it's easier to see, it's more tangible for us to understand that what's happening is they're taking down the Soviet monuments and putting up more nationalistic monuments to create this sense of that during the Ukrainian period in the Soviet Union, it was a time of occupation, it was a colonial period. Whereas in these areas, these have been a more transitional period that happened after during or after the Euromaidan revolution. Doing so sort of creates this idea that actually it could be a transitional period as well. And it shows that there are 2 aspects that are being competed with, whether and how Ukraine sees itself in relation to its Soviet past. So the importance of the monuments is that, one, having them is a physical representation of the past, but also taking them down leads into discussions over how does a nation reconceptualize itself, or what are being deemed the more important memories that define the culture that imbues the nation. So as I've said, the Lenin statues remain in Russia, they remain throughout, and this is arguably down to the fact that the Russian Federation in the 1990s saw itself as the direct inheritor of the USSR, and this can be argued to the fact that it's maintained the Soviet Union's position on the UN Security Council and the way it interacts with other nations on the international scene at large. And in doing so, it also inherits wider myths and narratives within society that define it. In particular, the most important one in the Soviet Union was the Great Patriotic War, or what we call the Second World War. This is celebrated on the 9th of May each year with huge parades in pretty much every city across Russia, and also most post-Soviet countries as well. This is because of the amount of suffering and death that occurred both for the military as well as the domestic populations of the republics of the Soviet Union. Over 20 million people died, which is the level of suffering that we cannot conceptualize at all, especially when we think about our own conceptions of World War I in the West. But in having this, though, the narratives that were promoted were this idea that everyone suffered equally, that there was a strong leadership under Stalin who led the country to victory, and that there is a great military prowess within the Soviet Union. The difficulty of using that and continuing this commemoration is that it is a myth and it is a narrative that was formulated for a different entity, much in the same way that the question over how Lenin was used in Ukraine after its independence. It's this question of what happens next. However, whereas we can see that Ukraine is questioning itself and has questioned its relationship to the Soviet Union and this past, Russia has not. Russia has seen itself as post-Soviet, as in seeing itself as continuing, although not in the communist ideology, but continuing on the same levels of international politics, for example. As such, since about 2005, 2007, there's been a reinvigoration of the Victory Day celebrations in Russia. And in particular, this ribbon here, the ribbon of St. George, has now become seen as a symbol of Russian patriotism and Russian nationalism, and is used as an official symbol of commemoration for the Second World War on that day, much in the way that the British Society uses the poppy through the month of November for Remembrance Sunday on the Remembrance Sunday. However, this ribbon itself is a rehabilitated and a co-opted period of history. It was originally part of the garb used for the Order of St. George, a military order in the Russian Empire, and then was then used as part, and then the Soviet Union rehabilitated it, giving it as part of the medal for anyone who had served in the Second World War. So you can see how even not just monuments, but other aspects of culture or like items can be rehabilitated and reused to create sort of an idea of continuity. Now, many scholars have pointed to the Second World War being like the foundational myth of Putin's Russia. This is because it focuses on the idea of like patriotic heroism, service to the country, and a strong leadership, all things that are very conducive to the way Putin administers his country. However, the difficulty is that if you continuously use the old narratives for a previously established nation or ideological creation, it doesn't always fit. So you have to find ways to co-opt it and change the narrative to make it say sort of, yes, we're continuing this practice, but in actual fact, we're doing it in our way. And the ribbon of St. George is one of the ways that this is done. A second one is the use of the Immortal Regiment marches in Russia, which younger generations of Russia are encouraged to wear traditional costumes from the war and march in the parade itself with pictures of family or relatives who have served or died during the Second World War. So sort of creating this idea of like continuing our link to this war in of itself. Now, in Russia, there's this organization called the Russian War Historical Society. I will not say it in Russian because it is an absolute mouthful and it's terrible to say. And since 2012, they've had this program called the Monumental Propaganda Program. The society itself is really interesting because it was created by Putin under a presidential decree with the express desire to instill the country with a sense of patriotic understanding about its past. And part of the Monumental Propaganda Program is that it's been expanding monument building, not just in Russia, but also abroad, but we're focusing on Russia today, of specific periods of Russian history, rehabilitating them or extending them. So this one here is a monument built to the Second World War, built in Kalmalsky in the Tambov region of Russia, so just a bit further east of Moscow. And it looks pretty much the same as every single monument that you will see to the Second World War in Russia built before this period. So it has a sort of an unknown, unidentifiable soldier in Soviet costume, At the front here is the eternal flame. It has placards around it demonstrating people who survived and who served, and it acts as a focal point to remember this war. However, really importantly is the background here. It is this use of the St. George ribbon. This had not been used typically before in the monuments built for the Second World War in Russia. So having this is sort of sending a really interesting signal, because it's saying, yes, absolutely, we are continuing to venerate the Second World War. It is so important, and justifiably so it is. However, it's sort of adding this slight tint that, yes, we're continuing the Soviet legacy, but we're changing how we engage with it and how we remember it in such a way that we are the society that's remembering it. It's not a Soviet way of remembering it, it's the new Russian way of remembering it. Interestingly as well, the Society's monumental propaganda program extends beyond like the Soviet realms of Russian Soviet history. It also has been building monuments to sort of imperial figures all the way back, like 600, 500 years. One of them being Grand Duke Vladimir. This is the monument I took when I was in Moscow, like not last summer, the summer before. It's about 150 meters away from the Kremlin in Moscow, so absolutely dead center, and it is a huge, huge monument. For those who don't know, because it's not common knowledge unless you're in Russian studies, Grand Duke Vladimir is known for being the person who converted the Russian people to Orthodoxy. And there is a wider sort of trend at the moment in discourse and memory wars between Ukraine and Russia over who is the real inheritor of the Kievan Rus, who is the true Orthodox nation to a certain extent. And this is where this symbolic capital comes back in. In building this monument so centrally in Moscow, so close to the seat of government, it's sending a clear signal that Orthodoxy is an important aspect of Russian identity, but more importantly, that the Russians' claims to being the inheritors of the Kievan Rus is substantiated, that is a fundamental aspect of the Russian identity that is formulated at the moment in Russia. And we can also add more credence to this when we acknowledge that Putin opened the monument, so did the Patriarch of Moscow as well. He blessed the monument. So we can see how this signaling and this sort of elite building of monuments is showing the nation what they should see as important aspects of their cultural identity. Interestingly as well is this monument here built in 2014 on Poklyanaya Gora. So Poklyanaya Gora is a sort of park, sort of complex with a museum to the Second World War in Moscow. It's like the hallowed ground at which the memory of the Second World War is absolutely fundamental. It's there, it's big, it's obvious. Now, this is actually a monument to the First World War, and the First World War has been seen as the forgotten war of Russian history. That's because it tantamounted to a huge loss to the Russian people, the loss of empire, and it fundamentally brought in the Russian Revolution. There's no necessity to think about it, to commemorate it, because during the Soviet Union period, it was seen as an imperial folly, as not necessary for the key aspects of identity. However, the RVEO has opened up this monument, and it was opened by Putin again, showing that the First World War rather is now an important aspect that should be considered fundamental and foundational to the identity of Russia. And when opening up the monument, Putin himself sat there and said that what we are commemorating and remembering here is the patriotic service and the patriotism and the heroism of those men who served and fought and died in the First World War. And this can be seen in the imagery as well. So we have the Russian imperial standard here on the Russian flag, which is the same, as well as a big burst of men sort of charging off to the left of the monument, with then other aspects of women helping out others and a priest at the background again. So you can see how there is this expansion in trying to claim back parts of Russian history to formulate the contemporary identity, or a contemporary view of the past that is conducive to patriotism, or a patriotic civic nationhood that is being used and is being developed in Putin's Russia. So this is why there isn't a huge importance in looking at these monuments, because we can see huge sort of swathes, whether it's in Ukraine or arguably in other countries as well, is that we can sit there and say how it shows how a country is representing itself and how it engages with its past. And monuments act as very sort of unsubtle, but also subtle, testaments to how a nation conceives itself. And the fact that people are spending money and their placement in central areas shows that this is something that should be incorporated and thought about. So the conclusions, it's sort of a very broad overview, but what we can sit there and say is that monuments remain very important a very important part of understanding how society views its past and what this past means to the present, how they're engaged with, what they do, what they represent. But it also shows the symbolic capital that is ascribed to monuments as well, especially in societies that are continuing to build more and more historical monuments, especially in areas that are more contentious or more fractious. It's not a static form of representation, as we've seen with the Lenin apparent in Ukraine. It can come down, something else can go up, it can change. And sometimes that is done on a regional level, as first happened in the west of Ukraine, or it can come on a national level, as happened in 2015 in Ukraine, or even with the monumental propaganda program of Russia in of itself. So what we can sit there and see is there is a huge importance around monuments and how they express themselves, how they are designed, what they present, because it engages with this whole aspect of what is deemed the most important aspects of a country's cultural past or even historical past. And what they represent is shown in the monuments, as with the Grand Duke Vladimir, showing, you know, the importance of orthodoxy to the present Russian state. That's a solid 25 minutes, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Joe. Feel free to unmute if you'd like for a moment.
Yay, yay, Joe.
So, and just two options on the questions, just I think maybe throw them out and just be sensitive to everyone not talking over each other on Zoom. And you could also put some into the chat, and Joe, you could probably field them in the chat if people put them in there.
Joe, I'm Charles Denby, as you can see on the screen, and I'm going to ask Alex to put us in touch personally going forward, because for quite a few years I've been very involved with a nonprofit called the Avenue Concept, which I think Alex now knows about. We are the first nonprofit in Providence to focus on putting art out in public. And obviously that includes 3D pieces as well as the very large murals you probably see around downtown. But certainly your interest is very relevant, and we'll talk about this in person again, hopefully down the road. But this country also is at a crossroads, which must be intriguing to you in terms of so-called cancel culture, and the obvious recent history of many monuments being torn down, especially in the South. So I know I'm wandering mentally. Do you think this country also is in the process of trying to redefine itself in terms of its own history or its self-concept? I'll stop there.
I think this process is like a continual process, and that's because whenever you look at like what I call the Palleting of Heroes, there's always a sorting, because the past is always used pragmatically to think about what is useful and what can help create a sort of conducive sense of civic nationhood. So when we think about what's happening in southern states in America, or has happened in questions over monuments in Western Europe as well, it's a very important thing to continuously be engaged with. And it's very difficult, one as an outsider, because I've been in New England for 4 years, so my conceptions of America are going to be very different to someone who is born and raised in the South. But in particular, if we think about like this in the South and the representation of Confederate generals or people who fought in that war, obviously it's very clear for a lot of people that this is a period of history that needs to not be forgotten, but needs to be reinterpreted and re-engaged with in such a way to show the actual both sides of it. And that is that for some, it will represent statehood and this idea of independence of statehood, whilst for arguably a majority, it shows a period of trying to entrench and maintain slavery. And I think especially what's happening at the moment in domestic politics and the change in rhetoric and the change in styles of politics, it's an important process that people need to engage with. Another good example is the removal of the Christopher Columbus statues in America. And if you look into the history of this as well, how this is actually created to try and placate and trying to incorporate and ingratiate the Italian-American aspects of American society in the early 20th century, you can see how it is completely malleable. So I think in terms of, I think America is trying to reconcile itself, and I think especially the other wider social movements like Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement is sort of changing this idea of what it means to be an American and what it means to be part of America. And I think it's an important thing that people realize is that you can take down a statue, but you can put up a statue again. And there are plethoras of people in history who represent the best parts of what people want. But then if we like exchange this into the question of like the placement of Winston Churchill outside of Parliament in London, Churchill is a problematic figure for lots and lots of reasons in terms of the way he conceived of race, the way he conceived of empire. But then on the other side, he did maintain and help lead Britain through the Second World War. So the whole issue is we've got to make sure that we maintain the ability to have open conversations and to understand the nuances around certain figures and certain narratives. But at the same time, we shouldn't fear losing a monument or losing a particular narrative, because every society is so rich that you can always supplement it with someone else, or you can focus on the modern day. And it's part of a wider conception that I think is happening. And I think that has come through the more confrontational domestic policies of Donald Trump and the divide that is more apparent in the country as well. So I think it's part of a bigger process, and it's not unique to America, it's not unique to Russia. It happens in every society all the time. Everyone is constantly trying to work out what is seen as the new normal, or what is seen as the most important things now. Because if you think about how society engaged or represented on certain minority issues 30, 40, even 50 years ago, it's completely diametric in opposition to what we have now. And it's about making sure that monuments can change, or if they can't change, then you take them down. And it needs to be able to reconcile that is a natural part of society. So a question that Reese has put in the chat is, how is history taught in schools in Russia versus former Soviet countries? So what does a role of the propaganda play? So this is like a really interesting topic that's going to form part of my dissertation. And with every single country across the world, there are standards, there are state-sanctioned textbooks. And of course, in every state-sanctioned textbook, there's sort of a desire and sort of a promotion of that country being like, the most brilliant country par excellence, even when it's in its worst period of history. Now, within the Russian one, there's been a lot of attention in the academy on specific textbooks like the Filipov textbooks, which imbue this idea of like patriotic service. And a scholar who I've worked with called Todd Hall, his new volume on bringing Stalin back in, talks about how Stalin's repressions are downplayed through their linguistic treatment in the textbooks in a way that allows Stalin to become more palpable and more usable as a sort of act or sort of a person in the cultural identity of Russia. So propaganda, it's difficult because like propaganda, when we think about it, we have these sort of connotations to like huge placards, to big speeches and all these things that, would bring up fascist elements. However, it's a fundamental part of society in order to create a wider sense of self, or like a conducive national imaginary. And it's always going to be there. But in Russia, is this idea, for example, of civic nationhood and patriotic Russian nationhood. And a good example of this is, so occasionally I do teach Russian students who are younger, and we talk about the First World War. So in Britain, we're taught that Britain fought alone from 1939 till 1945, and the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, was the most important part. Whereas Americans are taught, they came in 1941, 1942, and they saved the day. Whereas the Russians are taught, they were alone and Britain and America had no help whatsoever, and they came and saved Europe by itself. And all of them are completely true, whilst at the same time all being completely wrong. And that comes down to like, these are not nuanced views, because it's difficult to explain nuance to people, even when you're trying to engage with more learned people. It's just a difficult aspect of gaining with it. So the next question from Joseph Scott is like, are there statues celebrating folk tales? There are statues for everything in Russia. If you, for example, in this town of Obninsk, which had the first nuclear reactor in Russia, there are statues to the mice that were used in the experiments. There are statues in Omsk, for example, to people who helped build tunnels and helped build the sewage system plants. And of course, to fairy tales as well, like Baba Yaga, who is like this Russian witch in Russian folklore. So there are full aspects of it that have been erected either in the pre-revolutionary period, in the Soviet period, or even recently. However, the reason I've been looking at the Russian War Historical Society and the Leninapad is because of their links to governmental organizations. So I think the mouse melt ones there are definitely some in Obninsk, but if you type in Russia mice statues or cat science statues, they usually have a few of them online, but the difficulties are not always the best documented in online areas as well. But there's a huge amount of them as well. So for example, in Russia and the Soviet Union, they have a real legacy of venerating their writers. So for example, you will always have statues to Pushkin, to Nikolai Gogol, to Dostoevsky, to Tolstoy, to Mayakovsky throughout most Russian cities, especially if they have a link to them. So for example, Anton Chekhov, one of his most famous short stories is Dama sa Sobachkoi, so the woman with the little dog. And in Yalta, which is a very beautiful area of the world, they have a statue of this woman with her little dog, because that is where it was theoretically set, was down in Yalta in the Crimea on the Black Sea. And the same that if you go to the Moscow Metro, the St. Petersburg Metro, you have stations named after not just like the Square of the Revolution or Lenin or the Theatre Square. You also have them named after writers like Mayakovsky, who was a revolutionary writer. So you can see how it's not just monuments, but it's also the cityscape that imbues society with like what are the key cultural figures as well that they need to be engaging with.
We're exhausted.
Joe, do you have an academic appointment at Brown?
So I'm currently a PhD candidate in the Slavic Studies program. I'm pursuing an additional master's in political science as well. So previously I studied at the University of Leiden and the University of University of St. Andrews. So I'm in the I'm starting the dissertation period, and my dissertation is looking at how the period 1905 to 1922 approximately is linked, and how that is being presented in Russia through these narratives, through parks, through museums, in order to create a big, wider sense of Russianness that is sort of without rupture. That's the main aspect that I'm looking at. So I'm a PhD student, and the present I'm teaching a class on nationalism and nationalities, whilst also then next semester I'll probably be teaching the Russian language to some unfortunate first years, unfortunately for them. So they'll have to deal with me every day shouting Russian grammar at them in their face.
Okay, I'll be in touch courtesy of Alex down the road soon.
Wonderful.
So Joe, I miss you and your sense of humor, which I got to know when you were living at the house. And I've missed that for the years that you haven't been there. But it's wonderful to hear you present on your research. And I found it terrifically put together, and thank you.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. I certainly miss living at the International House and admit everyone there. It's actually very important organization for the entirety of Rhode Island and the wider Brown community as well. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to ask about Russia in general? Yes, Joan? You're on mute.
Not a question, just a compliment.
I feel so much more informed because of your talk. There are things that have been such a mystery to me. And I have many Russian neighbors who came here 30 years ago, most of them from Ukraine. And whenever they attempt to talk about their background or their childhood, they just burst into tears and can't talk anymore. And they're very, very traumatized by everything that happened that drove them to come to the United States.
Yeah, and this is a difficult aspect when like looking at Russia, is because there are Russia's got this strange phenomenon that there are lots of emigre communities. One, you have the emigre community that sort of emerged in the 1920s after the revolution, and then throughout the Soviet period, as well as people left the Soviet Union, as well as the post-Soviet one as well. And it's very difficult because a lot of people who left the Soviet Union in the 1990s did so for economic reasons or for more, to try and get more advantages out of life. But when you talk to people in Russia, so for example, in St. Petersburg, I lived with the most fantastic woman called Valentina and her husband Gennady. And they were talking about how for them, they loved the Soviet Union because for them there was such stability that they knew that they would have an apartment, they knew they would have food, they knew they could have healthcare. And what is really interesting in this entire period is that after the transition to democracy in 1990, there was such an economic shock, people lost so much money, there was a lack of the rule of law. This is such a formative period. And even when we think about the 1990s for us in Western Europe or even America, that yes, there was economic downturn, there were issues in the 1980s as well, but the level of it was completely not. So it's this whole thing of when engaging with memory, and especially on such a rich cultural background as the Russian Federation, you have these competing views of, you have emigres who left before the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the Soviet Union, recently, those who have maintained their lives in Russia, those who have got families still in Russia. It all comes down to like what one thing can mean to one person will mean something completely different, which is really interesting. It's a very, very interesting process in terms of, which I love about memory study, is because, you know, especially in places like Britain, which are hyper-regionalized. So I'm from a county called Yorkshire and my family from Derbyshire. So the ways that like we conceptualize things or engage with things are very different from people in the south of the country, or the way that people in Scotland work out their own views as well. And it's important to look at how this is done on a national scale as well. So Michael has asked that you mentioned monuments are often installed by the political elite and people, institutions in positions of power. How do you see politically disenfranchised groups expressing the narratives of history and culture? So the difficulty of this, which is a huge sort of minefield for my dissertation, my wider work, is that our conception of like civil society and like public space is sort of this enlightened view and a very Western European. And we have to remember that in the Soviet Union, it was not the same system as Western democracies or consolidated democracies. And that has sort of transpired into the fact that there's low levels of trust in non-governmental organizations today. Civil society doesn't work in the same way in Russia. In Russia it does, because there are restrictive practices in place. So the difficulty is that there are disenfranchised people are allowed to congregate, they're allowed to have meetings, they're allowed to have exhibitions. But the difficulty of claiming public space, especially in this like transnational, this huge scale that the RVO represents, is that one, it's about access to funds. Two, it's about the legality of it. And three, especially in a society that has more restrictive practices, it's more difficult to do. So when thinking about Russia, it's very difficult to try and conceptualize of a monument to a disenfranchised group. However, in the 1990s, they did build monuments to those oppressed by the Stalinist purges, because that was the period in which they were able to actually learn about what had happened. The history textbooks opened up, the archives opened up, there are monuments to repressions, there are museums to the gulags. However, the difficulty comes into it of that is a very difficult aspect of a national history to engage with. So there have been notes in certain journals and books of these museums being slowly closed or being changed a little bit. So there is talks of a wider question of how does the Russian society, Russian government engage with the Russian public. It makes it more difficult, but there are avenues But the difficulty is that certain laws do prevent certain congregations or certain disenfranchised groups from demonstrating themselves or what they perceive as their own culture.
May I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Yes, you only mentioned Stalin once or twice, and I was just thinking about what happened to the statues commemorating him, because we have this problem now in the South, you know, statues commemorating Lee and so on. Is that a problem or not?
So Stalin's a really interesting figure because obviously in the aftermath of his death and the Khrushchev thaw, there was this whole reconciliation that what Stalin did and how he acted was not necessarily the best, and that's being very polite about it. But then obviously, because Stalin does represent this push towards modernity, this industrialization, the Second World War myth is inherently linked to him. He is the one who led the Soviet Union forward. He's always sort of stuck around, and especially in the sort of the methods and manners in which the Soviet Union was ruled through the Brezhnev period as well, sort of echoes this. And what Todd Nelson argues for is that there has been a rehabilitation of the image of Stalin. Now, this is not saying that there are brand new monuments to Stalin being built everywhere, although you can always find an instance of this being done. But Todd Nelson argues for in the wider conceptualization of Stalin, there is a thawing in which his atrocities are downplayed. So is this idea of a great man leading Russia, leading the Soviet Union, can be used in order to create sort of parallels between other great figures leading Russia in its earlier history or even its present history as well. So what's happening is it's around the discourse and not just the monuments, but museums, the textbooks. They are changing how Stalin is perceived in order to sort of make him more palpable. And if you look at polls on who is perceived as the greatest Russian or the greatest Soviet or the greatest person in Russian history, Stalin always scores in the top 10. So you can see how this is a problematizing factor, because whereas us who study Russia or even read a book on the Soviet Union, you'll learn of the repressions, of the purges, of what happened, of the issues of the Second World War, and you go, how can this be the case? Whereas in fact, for the Russians, it's because they don't conceive of it in the same way as we do. And a good example of this, for example, is the Holodomor in Ukraine, which is the mass famine that happened in the 1930s in Ukraine. That's seen as an act of genocide in Ukraine, whereas Russia does not perceive it as such. So it sort of shows how Stalin has still got this palpable figure. You still go to Red Square and there are men dressed up who look very convincingly like Lenin and Stalin, and you can get your pictures taken with him. Lots of the tourist stuff that you can buy in Russia, like Soviet placards, Soviet posters, have the imagery of Stalin. So he remains a very potent aspect of Russian identity even today. And even if you were to talk to somebody, World War II, Russia, Stalin, it comes up. He's part of the big three, and it's a very difficult part to sort of contend with. Is probably the best way to see it.
Thank you. That's interesting. Very interesting.
Pardon me for this. You are at Brown. You're probably aware that there is a current push to bring down the statues of Marcus Aurelius and Caesar Augustus. Do you have any thoughts on that situation?
I have to admit, I don't really have too many thoughts on that. I think obviously there are, there's issues there in terms of the legacies that they represent, also the people who funded them. And the very brilliant thing about being at Brown is that the student, especially the undergraduate community, is very open and very vocal about the discussions that it has around the monuments on campus. It's, for me, for example, I don't have a personal issue with them. I don't see the issue with them, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that there aren't issues with them, and a discussion needs to be had. And if consensus is made, they need to be removed. Well, then the administration should listen to the consensus, and that's the important aspect of it, because it also comes down to what other monuments or the statues are pushed around Brown. So, for example, Bluno, the blue bear with the lamp on it, has finally gone, and it was a monstrosity for the 4 years that it was here. And I think everyone was very happy that that statue that we had is gone. So it's about representing what represents Brown and what represents Brown culture, what represents Brown's identity. And I did find it very strange when I first came here. Why do we have Caesar and why do we have Marcus Aurelius at Brown? I was like, this, you know, we're not Italian. This isn't what, you know, we aren't a great school. We're not a school that focuses exclusively on classics. So the question is, I think, is we need to see what happens. I don't have too much to say about it, unfortunately. It's not something that occupies my mind, thankfully, in the evening. I think we have time for about one more question if anyone has anything they want to ask.
Yeah, actually, Joe, I might have missed this, I apologize, but the material, is there an unwritten rule of what kind of material is used for statues? I mean, if it's if it's for the, for a specific subject matter.
There is and there isn't. So, for example, it just happens that, like, with the Soviet of the Second World War, it's usually a bronze of a man. However, in Yaroslavl, they have this really beautiful monument where it's, so this is Yaroslavl in Russia, where I also lived. They have this monument with the eternal flame in the middle, and it's a man, and then it's a woman on the other side, and it's meant to, and it's sort of two rocks exploding apart. And that symbolizes, like, the breakage of the family and the loss that people had. But generally speaking, the more traditional ones do focus on, like, a Soviet soldier, or maybe someone in a forlorn position with the eternal flame. And the eternal flame is, like, just a symbol of that is always there. Whereas with Lenin, there are lots of statues of Lenin, there are lots of statues of Brezhnev and Stalin. They're usually sort of in some sort of profile. And with Brezhnev, so another former leader of the Soviet Union, you had all of his medals across here. Whereas this sort of, like, outreach, trying to get it into the camera, the outreach of Lenin is sort of to invoke that sense of the formation of the Soviet Union. However, interestingly, the RVO, the Russian War Historical Society, has opened up a new monument to the Second World War, which is huge on the border with Belarus. And it actually takes the formation of a soldier, but with cranes at the bottom, so the bird cranes, sort of forming into the body. And this is because there's an aspect of Russian society that sees cranes linking them to sort of loss and to mourning. So, and what's also really brilliant in Russia, and I recommend if you're interested in talking to people like Sam Driver or Sophia Verber, who look at conceptualist and non-conceptualist art. They're both graduate students in the department as well. Russia's got such a brilliant art scene. It's always been so fantastic with its literature and its art. There are lots of conceptual monuments, lots of new monuments, but it's this whole thing of, like, classical representations seem to always be the main one, mainly because there's less grounds for misinterpretation. Because if you have something that is not clear to the population, well, you don't want them getting the wrong idea or the wrong narrative. So if you have the same thing over and over and over again with a little bit of change, it's easier than if you have, it's like a big yellow pole and say, oh, this is to Maslenitsa, the sun god, the holiday that celebrates pancakes in Russia. So there's not really a guidebook as much as that you can infer and create your own one. I'm sure that those people who get the commission to make the monuments have got, like, set guidelines they have to follow, but I'm very glad that I do not have that as a job, because that would be very difficult to sit and, like, make sure everything is utterly perfect. It's something I would be very frightened to do. So I'm very glad I'm not an artist.
Well, Joe, just on behalf of everyone here, thank you. Thanks for a great talk and great response to the questions and everything. Appreciate your time.
My absolute pleasure. My absolute pleasure.
And just as we head out, just wishing everyone a good Thanksgiving and small Thanksgivings this year, hopefully with not too many people. We're not going to be meeting next week. The following week, actually, Jane Lancaster, who's here, is going to be talking about women in Rhode Island history. She's a historian, and she's got a great talk lined up for 2 weeks from today. And if you'd like to come back for dinner tonight, we have our annual meeting tonight, which only happens once a year, but students, a few of the residents, about 8 to 10 different people who are involved in International House are all going to give short presentations, and we'll just talk about the year that was and the year to come. So love to see you there tonight at 6. And the final announcement is we're no holiday bazaar this year. That's usually an event that we do, but we do have a puzzle thanks to Sarah Jane, who's also here, and Joe. And I think we've 50 puzzles. I think we've sold 6 of them already in the last week. So there's whatever that makes, 44 left. So if you want to support the International House and get a 504-piece puzzle, let us know. And with that, if anyone else has any final announcements or things they want to say, jump in.
Again, I'll just mention that if anybody, since there are new people here today, if anybody knows other people who would like to speak at these luncheons, just get in touch with Alex and then we can coordinate. I'm still involved with the program committee and I love these talks. There's something that is, I look forward to every week. So if anybody would either themselves like to share with us anything about what they're working on, just let Alex know. So thanks. And happy Thanksgiving. I'll miss the big gathering, just 4 of us this year.
Okay, thanks again, Joe, and wishing everyone a good rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.
See some of you again tonight. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Alex, do you have a hot second or did you skip that?